finality to the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise in support of this important legislation and commend Ms. Sewell and Ms. Roby for their leadership in chronicling an extraordinary time in our march toward a more perfect union. It seems altogether fitting on the eve of the anniversary march commemorating what history records as Bloody Sunday and at the end of Black History Month that we consider this resolution, which will create a process for preserving the valuable oral history of those members of Congress who were early leaders in the American Civil Rights Movement. You know, there are very few giants these days in public life, but John Lewis is among them. And let me say what a privilege it has been for me these last 11 years to serve and to befriend my colleague, Congressman John Lewis. And I thank you for your leadership on this resolution. There's also an effort in this resolution to give members of Congress who have participated in the annual pilgrimage to Selma and Montgomery to reflect on their experiences, and I'll be very humbled to be a small part of that. I was honored to serve as the co-leader of the 10th Congressional Civil Rights Pilgrimage, sponsored by the Faith and Politics Institute in March of 2010, and I can say, as my colleague Mr. Lewis knows, it was a life-changing experience for my wife Karen, for our 3 teenage children, and I'll forever be grateful for the experience. We started the weekend at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, the home church of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We sat in the pews as we heard Dorothy Cotton and others talk about their years in that church and how their faith in Christ sustained the cause of liberty and the cause of civil rights. We made our way to the Civil Rights Memorial to honor and remember those who'd lost their lives in the struggle for equality. But the next day, traveling with my colleague John Lewis to Selma to mark the anniversary of a day that changed his life and changed his nation, March 7th, 1965, known as Bloody Sunday, we will always remember. The night before, John had recounted that momentous day. He told how he and several hundred courageous activists had crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, but it was actually being a part of the reenactment that most touched our hearts as a family. We had gathered at the Brown Chapel in Selma before we made the march, and then, along with thousands, we made our way the few short miles to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. For my part, John, I walked with Dr. H.Res, pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Selma at the time. As we strolled that historic route, I was enthralled as Dr. Reese, 80-some-odd years young, recounted the day as if it had been the day before. He told me how the Edmund Pettus Bridge crests at the middle, and so that it was not until you all reached the top of the bridge that you knew what was waiting on the other side. And he described to me said, quote, all you saw was a sea of blue when they crested the bridge.
Recognized for an additional minute.
An additional minute.
I thank the gentleman. I turned to Dr. Reese and I said to him, did you think about turning back? And he said to me, quote, no, we had prayed at the Brown Chapel and we decided to go on regardless. And so you did. It's just extraordinary to think of the beatings that took place that day. Our own colleague experienced a notorious beating at the time. But as the march that day, the reenactment came to an end, I extended my hand to Dr. Reese. I thanked him not only for what he had done for the civil rights movement, for what John Lewis had done for the civil rights movement, but for what they all had done for America. And he put his hand on my shoulder, Dr. Reese did, and he said, Mike, God did something here. And so he did. Through these extraordinary and courageous Americans, we forged a more perfect union. And so I rise in support of this resolution, commend my colleagues who will participate this weekend in Montgomery and Selma in this historic reenactment. But I commend Congressman John Lewis, Dorothy Cotton, F.D. Reese, and all of those great Americans who on that day made the sacrifices necessary to further perfect this last best hope of earth. We should always safeguard this history, cherish it, and emulate their courage and bravery. So help us God. I yield back.
The gentleman signed